Photoshop's blurs can be used to simulate motion in a still image. When you open up this image called road.jpg, you'll see that it has some blur in the background and on this pole because I shot this while I was on the passenger side of my truck. But I want to really blow this blur out, and I'm going to show you a really cool technique to give the illusion of movement. I'm going to go to my layers panel, and I'm actually going to duplicate this layer by clicking on it and dragging it to the new layer icon like so. I'm also going to rename this top copy Blur. Now I'm going to go to my filter menu, choose Blur, Motion Blur. And by the way, you can see there's all kinds of blurs in here, and they all have different controls. But for now, I'll just stick to Motion Blur, and we'll come back and try another one in a moment. The Motion Blur dialog box opens. You'll see that we have a preview checkbox. When you enable it, you see the actual result in the image. You have an angle text field and an angle dial that controls the angle of the blur. And most important is this distance. You can really blow it out to create some really cool effects, or try to go a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to go to about 70. And now I'm going to click let me see here, the dial looks about right. I think that's great. I'll click OK. And now I'm going to show you why I chose to create this on a separate layer. I'm actually going to press Command or Control T on my keyboard and stretch this layer. And I'll hit Enter or Return to accept it. And I'll move it over like so. Now on my Layers panel, I'm going to drop the opacity down so that the blur looks like it's only happening on the trees and the pole and everything else, but not quite, because we have this illusion of motion that we really couldn't get if we just used the blur layer itself. So I'm going to just increase this once more and show you the difference. Here's how it will look if I just use the blur on the image. But by having it on its own layer and dropping it down, I can modify how powerful that blur is myself. So I can see the blur, but still see the other elements in nice crisp clarity. All right, so that's an example of the motion blur. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that layer now. And I'm going to actually double click on this layer to unlock it. I'm going to apply a different type of blur to this guy. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. A radial blur is really good for simulating what it would look like if somebody hit you in the back of your head really hard. So what you could do is pretty much use this amount slider and look here in the blur preview to see what's going to happen to your image once you hit OK. You can choose spin or zoom. Zoom is really good for simulating that Star Wars thing when you're zooming in to warp speed. So I'm going to go ahead and hit spin. And now we see we have this really cool effect. This is really good to use to show wheels spinning and that kind of thing, looking inside of a washing machine. This time I'm going to go back to Filter, and I'll go back to that blur, Radial Blur, and I'll put it on Zoom. Of course we can always change the quality, but I usually just leave it on Good. I'll go ahead and put it on OK, and now we're going into warp speed into the trees. So blurs work by pretty much looking at the pixels next to the other pixels and averaging them to give you the simulation of motion in your images.